and recently I was elected to serve on their board. And so even just Friday, I was in St. Louis for a real quick trip over there for board meetings, and I got to see more of what this organization is doing. And I really, the more I learn, the more excited I get about what ITEM is doing. And I'm going to show you in just a minute, I'm going to show you a little video that summarizes their work, but I just want to put in front of you the mission statement that ITEM has so that you get a sense of what ITEM is doing. And then I want to, after I share that, I want to share with you a little bit about what I was involved in Ukraine about 2 weeks ago. I was there for 1 week, a very short week, but a very busy and packed full week. And I just want to share with you about that and help you see what God is doing in these places. So, ITEM's mission, if we could, Matt, put that slide up, the first slide there, the second one, I guess it is. ITEM's mission is to provide biblically based Reformed teaching and training worldwide to indigenous church leaders for ministry. Now, in a nutshell, what that means is that they come alongside of local organizations in different parts of the world. ITEM itself is not so much about sending missionaries to go long term, but it's about coming alongside of local organizations, usually seminaries, and it's to help them get the training that they otherwise can't get from other places and otherwise haven't had the opportunity to get. And so ITEM really is about recruiting volunteers, pastors, and some seminary professors who then volunteer for a week or two at a time and go overseas, usually to teach one course at a time. But then in the rest of the time, it's the local seminary that's doing most of the work. And the goal is always to try to work themselves out of a job. In other words, ITEM doesn't want to be in any one place long term in most cases. They want that seminary to become self-supporting. And they want to raise up enough leaders in a given place so that eventually then ITEM can pull back and let that seminary then be self-sufficient. So currently ITEM works in probably close to a dozen countries. Many of them are former countries that were formerly under the influence of the Soviet Union. So Ukraine is one of the larger ones that ITEM is involved in, but also Croatia, Latvia, Lithuania, parts of Russia. They're actually in one place in Russia. And there's a couple more in Eastern Europe, and then they're also now opening up fields in India and in Indonesia, and then they're exploring fields in a field in Kenya and in Colombia. And so they go through a process to look and determine, are these viable places? Do these seminaries and do these local places have the people in place? Do they have a genuine need? And can we form a good partnership for them? And if those criteria can be met, then we open that field up to people to go and serving there. So I don't have I should have brought a little map that shows you all the places, but you kind of get the sense of where it is. The philosophy of ITEM is on the next slide. I'll just have Matt put that up. We send pastors and professors to the students to minimize cost and to maximize learning opportunities in their own contexts near their families and ministries. In other words, if you think about it this way, if you're dealing with a country where typically they're developing countries, the finances there economically, it's very difficult to have a pastor travel to the United States to do 3 years of seminary. That would be almost impossible. And so what ITEM does is, cost-wise, it makes more sense to bring a trainer or an instructor overseas to where the pastors are, to spend a week at a time training them and teaching them, and then that way the impact of the ministry dollars, if you will, is maximized. It just makes more sense to do it that way, so that these pastors can continue. Many of them are bivocational, which means they're working 2 jobs and doing ministry on top of that, and so they can't just leave their jobs. They can't just leave their families to go. Even for 6 weeks would be very difficult. So they can, this way, ITEM works, kind of does it by bringing the pastors bringing the trainers to where the pastors are at. And the neat thing is that it's all volunteers, right? All the people that go over, myself and others, I think there are something like 70 pastors around the United States that volunteer. We're all volunteers. Most of us are pastors. I think, at least speaking for myself, I don't ever want to really leave the pastorate, but I love the opportunity to go a week at a time and teach and see a little bit of what God is doing in other places. So I'm going to show you a video now, and this is put out by ITEM, and it'll just maybe give you a little more sense of what item the organization does. And then after that, I'll get a little more specific in terms of what my work was about in Ukraine. So we'll have Matt put this up for us. So that's in a nutshell what item is about. And I guess the one thing I want to draw your attention to there is the need in terms of the need for a foundation of grace, especially in so Soviet Union used to be, of course, a very repressive country, right? They did not want to have any Christians, missionaries anywhere in the country, and so as a result of that, many of these countries, the church had to be very underground, had to be very discreet, and that also meant that there was very little training for pastors in these countries who were pastoring their churches, and I actually regard them highly in one sense because they're trying to pastor these churches, but they've had no training. And I think God used them during the time of the Soviet Union to keep these churches alive. But what has happened now since the fall of the Soviet Union, these countries now have the opportunity to bring in pastors. And what the church climate is like in at least Ukraine is, as Will Hesterberg said in the video, it is very legalistic. They do focus a lot on the rules that Christians need to keep, and it lacks that real foundation of grace that is so important then that we may even take for granted. And so when we do these preaching conferences, what we are doing, myself and Bill Wilton, we are trying to show pastors how to preach biblically, so taking a passage and how to understand it and how to dissect a text, and then we bring the focus to to making the sermon Christ-centered, so that every sermon is rooted in the gospel, and we try to give very practical techniques for doing that. And so that's what the 3 times that I've gone. That's what we've done. We've done these 2-day preaching seminars for pastors, and we invite. We work with 2 organizations. We work with that are in Ukraine. The one is Kyiv Regional Bible College. That's the one that we worked with this time, and we've also done some work with the Evangelical Reformed Seminary of Ukraine, which is also training pastors. But in this case, we were just working with the Bible College, and they recruited and they invited in. We had, I think, about 60 pastors, and there were even some young men who were not in seminary yet, but were considering going to seminary, or were involved in leadership in their own local church. And so we spent 2 days with them. Now, the exciting thing was that, number one, this was the largest turnout that we've had in the time we've been doing these, the 3 times we've done them. But also, number two, the average age was much younger. The first time we did it was the first time that I was involved was back in October of 2015, and we had maybe 20 people there. And the average age was probably mid to late 50s. Now, there's nothing wrong with being in your mid to late 50s, but when you've been pastoring for already 30 years, the likelihood of you learning something radically new in 2 days is slim. Now, hopefully, it's an encouragement. Hopefully, it gives them something to think about. But when we have a room full of people who are on the younger edge and they're eager and excited to learn, we think that the impact is potentially much larger. And we even had a guy who was there. He was, I don't know, I put him probably maybe 25 years old. And second day we're there, he raises his hand and says, "Could we pray for my wife? She's in the hospital giving birth to our child." And I'm thinking now, if I was at a preaching conference and my wife was giving birth, I would not maybe have a home to come home to after that. But maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think that illustrates the enthusiasm that there is for this material. And it's nothing to say about myself or Bill. It's just to show the passion that there is for this. So we brought students, we bussed them in. I say we, the local organization arranged for transportation into, it was really like Camp Tadmor. It was a camp with all the basketball courts and volleyball nets, and they use it that way as a church camp throughout the rest of the summer. But it was in middle of March, so it was pretty empty there, and so we had the facilities all to ourselves, and you can see the room, and it is full of people there. And I put that quote up there, and I think I shared that this morning. One of the most challenging tasks of preaching the gospel from the Gospels is preaching the gospel. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that. We were looking at the Gospel of Mark. The seminar breaks down really into 3 parts. We give lectures. There are 4 main lectures that we give, and then we break into small groups. And in the small groups, we have the groups work through 4 different Bible passages. So they're actually taking the material that we've taught them, and they're trying to integrate that and apply that in their as they're working through these texts. And then the third part of the seminar, we actually preach sermons. We give 4 messages to them. They have to be abbreviated because shorter messages, because we're working through a translator, and so a message that would be 30 minutes here would end up being like 60 minutes over there. So we have to. It's sort of a mini sermon, but we do that so they can see the principles that we're teaching in action, and as we're sort of demonstrating them. So this is just a lecture time. We worked again through the Gospel of Mark, and talked with them and showed them how to preach the gospel from the Gospels. Next slide is just a few more scenes. One of the things you sort of begin to learn is that things get very spontaneous when you're part of these seminars. These are sort of like regional gatherings of all the pastors, and so they get together, and it's sort of like they haven't seen each other in a little while. But one of the things that happened is they brought in, on the top left there, you see this. It was a men's choir, and they sang these beautiful songs. I didn't understand a word of it, but it was beautiful music, listening to them sing in Russian. And it was just sort of like, yeah, the choir's here. They're going to sing throughout the day for us. So we just, okay, well, get to listen to Russian music, and it really was quite enjoyable. Bottom left, you see that's my colleague. I think most of you know Pastor Bill Wilton from Sunrise Church in McMinnville. He actually did 2 seminars while he was gone for 2 weeks of teaching. He was first in Romania. That's the other country in Campina, I think it's called. Camille's here. You might know the pronunciation better than I do, but not to draw attention to you. But anyways, he was doing the same thing in Romania with a local missionary there, and he was there the week before, and then he traveled back to Ukraine, and we ended up meeting up in Ukraine, and then we did the same seminar the following weekend. On the main picture on the right, and you see my translator, or our translator, Natasha, and in a minute I'm going to tell you a little story about her, but everything has to be done through translators. There are few of them, especially the younger people, they do speak English, and so that actually helps, but still there's quite a few that English is they only know a few basic words, and so most of it is done in Russian. It is interesting that, first time I went to Ukraine, I thought, well, I better start learning some Ukrainian, so I used an app on my iPad called Duolingo to learn Ukrainian, and I spent about 3 months doing that. Then I realized actually most people here speak Russian. So I learned all this Ukrainian, but nobody speaks Ukrainian. They all speak Russian. Although there are people in Ukraine take some amount of pride in having their own language, it's just not very widespread yet because most of them were raised learning Russian. So anyways, a little story. Let's go to the next slide. A little story about Natasha. One of the things that I enjoyed particularly this trip was just listening to the stories of some of the people. And of course, sometimes that's really hard to do because communication is really hard. But when you have a translator, the translator, especially if she tells you her story, it's in English, so you can make sense of it. But Natasha was raised during the time of the Soviet Union, and so she was raised in a non-Christian home. She was not a believer. I believe by the time she got married, she still was not a believer, but she trained as a translator. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, then there was a huge need for translators because all the Western businesses and such were coming in. And so that's what she did. You actually go to school for that, and you train to become a translator. Well, she'd been doing this for a little while, and then a seminary asked her if they could hire her as a translator. And she says, I don't really want to do that. I'm not a Christian. I don't believe any of that stuff about the Bible. So no, she didn't really want to do it. Well, they asked again, and she kind of needed the money because the economy was really in rough shape there. So she finally agreed to do it. She says, but I don't believe any of that stuff. I'm just going to translate. So she begins translating for the seminary on a regular basis, sitting in on the classes and such. And lo and behold, she becomes a Christian. She's converted as she's being a translator. So as my friend Bill put it, he says, you know what, you were getting paid to hear the gospel. And that was just, to me, such a neat story of how God is working in all of this in ways that are just so surprising. You have someone who's really resistant to the gospel and really is not interested in it, and yet God makes a way for her to hear the gospel and now to come to Christ. She's a very strong believer. Her husband, she and her husband lived, I should say, down in the region Donetsk, which is currently where the Russians are kind of pushing into Ukraine, and that's where you hear on the news the conflict in Ukraine is down near in Donetsk. Her family is from there, and her husband still lives there about half the time. So for about 2 weeks out of the month, he's there. He's trying to make some money. He's trying to run the family business, trying to keep it alive. But then the other 2 weeks, he takes a 30-hour train ride back to Kyiv and goes through all the military checkpoints and gets back to the city where she lives with their 2 college-age girls. And it just struck me, we hear we don't hear very much on the news about what's going on in Ukraine. It's getting a little more press time now, but it is a very real conflict. It is having an impact on the lives of many people in Ukraine. And when you hear it told by your translator that yes, her life has really been turned upside down by this, it's really it's a sobering thought. People sometimes wonder. They've asked me, well, is it safe in Ukraine right now? And the answer is yes, it is. Aside from driving on the roads there, which is a whole other story. But in terms of the conflict, that's not really a pressing issue in the city of Kyiv. But when you get, all the way down to this the region of Donetsk and Donbass, and then it is. I mean, it is a dangerous thing. The conflict is very real, and the people of Ukraine are very aware of what's going on, and they're very concerned about what Russia is doing and what Putin is doing at this point. So. The other story I want to share on the bottom, I know the picture isn't quite as clear, that is, his name is George DeVeist. Now, George is a Christian Reformed world missionary in Ukraine. So he's a member of the CRC, and he's a missionary that was sent over there. He's been over there quite some time with his family, Sarah, and their children. On Sunday, we went to their church. Their church in the morning is Russian speaking. In the evening, it's an English service. They invited me to preach there, which I was glad to do. It's a lot of expats. There's doctors there. There are, from Western countries that come, and they hear that there's this church that does have an English service, and so the service is kind of a mix of people from all walks of life, and so I was able to preach there. George was there in the evening because George, again, his family is English bilingual, but George told me a little bit about what they're doing on behalf of the Christian Reformed Church in Ukraine. George travels down to the region where the conflict in Ukraine is currently taking place, and he'll spend a week there at a time, and he leads seminars and workshops on racial reconciliation. And it's having a tremendous impact on the churches and the believers there because the conflict, of course, has a lot of ethnic roots to it, and so there's tension between Russians and Ukrainians and so on. And so he works with these churches and with these individuals to help them understand the roots of racial tension and to try to bring some of them together. And he was telling me about what they're doing and the impact that it's having. People are sitting across the table from Ukrainians across from Russians, and they're coming to realize all the ways that each Ukrainians and Russians have hurt one another over centuries, really. And it's having an impact as they see the gospel is really meant to bridge those gaps that go deeper than our race and our ethnicity. And so he does that, and it was just fascinating to me to hear about how he is working down in that part of the world in a place that's torn by war and conflict, and yet he's serving to hopefully bring some of that about. Now, what sad thing he told me was the people who are most resistant to what he's trying to do are the pastors of these churches, which I don't understand why, but that's what he said. He said the pastors didn't seem to think that the churches needed it. It sounded like possibly some of the hesitation was, we need to keep our national pride, right? And national pride can get in the way of reconciliation. So the pastors were very resistant to that, it sounded like. But anyways, and he was leaving again the day after that church service. He was going to travel down again and lead another one that would have finished up last weekend, I think. So anyways, that's how George and Sarah devised. The last thing I did in the next slide is the seminary. So most of the work that I did was with the Kyiv Regional Bible College, but one night the seminary over there invited me to spend an evening with their students. The seminary is the Evangelical Reformed Seminary of Ukraine, so they just call it URSU for short. Some of you may remember Alistair and Sarah Torrance. They were here about a year ago, maybe a little less than a year ago, and they shared about their work. Alistair he's one of the leaders at the seminary, and he teaches there as well. And they're working with young students, most of them. Some of them are a little bit, second career students and that, but the seminary is working to train up pastors in the Reformed heritage and the Reformed faith. They invited me to come one night and share the material I had taught at the preaching seminar, and so I did that. Now, the picture you see on the top left there with all the wood, that's where the seminary actually meets. It's about 65 miles outside of the city of Kyiv, so you have to take a kind of a long drive out there, and what it was a Soviet-era camp where the Soviet government, if they wanted to reward some of their high-ranking politicians, they would give the family a week away at one of these camps. And so they're, in a way, the facilities are a little bit like Camp Tadmor, but probably, a little bit bigger, a little bit more dormitory style. But that's what they were intended for, to be a weekend retreat or a week-long retreat for Soviet politicians. Well, once the Soviet Empire fell, they had all these camps scattered throughout Russia and Ukraine and other former Russian or Soviet places. So they're used now really for summer retreats and summer camps, sometimes for orphans, sometimes for really whoever wants to rent them. And so the seminary has to rent the building for a week at a time. They don't have a building yet, although they were in the process of signing papers for a building of their very own in Kyiv, which would be a tremendous thing if that would go through, because right now they have to travel, an hour and a half in the car. to get out to this little remote place. And it's not the nicest place. I mean, it's kind of run down, and the facilities aren't the greatest. But that's where they meet for a week at a time. They do their classes all day and into the evening. And they invited me to come up there Monday night, and I basically worked through all my material in about 2 hours. So I was, especially going through a translator, it was pretty laborious. But it was, again, a neat group of students. One of the students there he was a chaplain with the army, and he too was serving down in this conflict-torn place. And so, I used an analogy, even really without thinking about it, saying, what does Jesus mean when he teaches us to love our enemies? Well, he actually had a question about that. He said, I'm a soldier. I'm a chaplain down with these soldiers, and they asked me, how do we love our enemies when we're shooting at them and they're shooting at us? And it just occurred to me that, that's something we say all the time, right? We talk about loving our enemies, and here was someone that really was dealing with that in a very real way, and it sort of made me pause and think, the temptation is just to give simple answers, but these are very real challenges, what it means to love your enemy. And so, anyways, yeah, I just hearing their stories and hearing the struggles and the challenges that they face. And they'll be there again. They'll be there for a week at a time. Then they'll go back to their families. And then 6 months later or 3 months later, whatever it is, they get back and do another semester of study. So anyways, last slide, I just want to express my thanks to Sunnyslope Church, because the support and the encouragement that I receive is just tremendous. Financially is part of it, but also just the questions people ask and the encouragement and the support that I've received from all of you it means the world to me. Like I've said before, I don't ever want to become a missionary. I don't think God is calling me to that. I don't think that God is calling me to ever to teach in a seminary. I'm very happy doing what I'm doing now, but I love the opportunity every once a year or so to go and teach in these places. I learn a lot. I'm very encouraged in doing that. Lord willing, while I'm on sabbatical, I'll be going again to India and Indonesia to do the same material. Now, there's a little of that's up in the air. India is becoming a very closed country right now. The government of India is a Hindu government, and they're very Hindu nationalistic, and so it's becoming harder and harder to even get a visa to go in, unless you're a business person. They'll let business people in, but they kicked out Compassion International not that long ago, which is a big thing, but they did that. That says a lot about the climate in India right now. And they also, they're really just cracking down on any foreigners coming in. And so we'll have to wait and see. The plan that's going into place now, that item is putting into place, is that they'll send us to Malaysia, and then they'll bring 4 or 5 people from India to Malaysia, and then we can teach them there, then they can go back to India. But that's sort of up in the air right now. But Lord willing, I'm hoping to still have the door open to go into India in August, and then also down to Indonesia, where the enthusiasm for this is just tremendous. They did a seminar, one of the item staff members did a seminar in Indonesia. I think they had 120 people showing up to learn for a week. So there's a lot of enthusiasm, and it's really neat just to see how God is working to train and equip pastors and future teachers and elders in different parts of the world so that they can better shape the hearts and minds of their congregation. So thank you for all the support that you have put forward to that end for myself and for the item organization. I've got time for maybe a couple questions if there are anything that you'd be interested to know a little bit more about. I'm no expert by any means, but if you have a question, maybe I can try to answer it. Sure. Yeah, so I dodged it a little bit. I suggested that he said to me, he said what he tells his soldier is that you engage in warfare, but you do it without hating them. And I said, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then here's where I dodged a little bit. I said, C.S. Lewis has written a lot about that, and that is true. He wrote, because C.S. Lewis wrote during Second World War. And so I said, you should check out some of the things he's written, because he could probably say it better than I could. So that's a little bit of a dodge. I know what C.S. Lewis said was, when you're writing in talking to Christians in wartime, he says it's very easy to imagine that two people are shooting at each other, and moments later, they're both in heaven together, and they're sort of, I don't think he said laughing about it, but they're looking down and they see from a whole different perspective. That was what C.S. Lewis was saying. and that's kind of I didn't actually come out and say that because, again, I wanted to be sensitive to the harsh reality that he was dealing with. But I kind of, I affirmed what he was saying, and then I told him to go read C.S. Lewis. So I don't know, I guess it was kind of ducking the question a little bit. But again, I don't want to come across like I'm the outsider that has all the answers to someone who's really literally on